and valued by traditional school establishments. And whenever I said, okay, what is it you're looking for? What is it you care about in your classrooms? Teachers would say things like, I just want kids to learn. I want them to be hungry for knowledge. I want them to be curious. Sometimes they used that word and sometimes they didn't. But I realized that's what they were saying. And that led me on, well, so then I left those conversations thinking, okay, people value what they measure and they measure what they value. If we want curiosity to be the outcome, the important thing that we're doing in school, then we have to figure out how to measure it. I know I'll measure curiosity. I'll just solve all the problems of schools by coming up with that measure. And that led me to about 12 years of research, because how silly of me to think that I would just figure that out so easily. I tell you all that because one of the first things I had to do as a researcher was define curiosity. And you know, Wendy, so jump in and interrupt me anytime. But you and I both know that there are several different ways to measure it, and it depends a little on why you're measuring it, sort of what you're interested in. I was interested in its origins. How does it emerge? Sort of, if you look at a 4-year-old and they're opening things or asking questions or tinkering with things, when did they start to have that inclination, and what did it look like in the beginning? Because, you know, teachers and developmental psychologists are interested in how things change over time and during childhood. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that the definition that I tend to use is that curiosity is the urge to reduce uncertainty or explain the unexpected. And I didn't make those up. Those come from Jerome Kagan and Jean Piaget. And they capture the basic impulse that is always happening when someone's curious. So everybody in the audience could think about this. You come upon something unexpected. You see something crawling in the grass, or you see a person, you hear a person say something that you've never heard before, or you watch an incident on the street that unlike any you've ever seen before. And in that moment, you think, what's going on there? This isn't what I expected, or this is like nothing else I've ever seen. And that leads you into the process of finding out more. And when you think about a toddler or a preschooler, or even say a 7-year-old, their days are filled with moments they didn't expect or that they've never encountered before. And the feeling they have or the behavior they exhibit, the moment that they try to figure out what's happening, whether they look or they tinker or they ask or they read a book or they go online, those are all efforts to explain the unexpected or resolve uncertainty. So that's the definition I use. I could go on and on, you know, I could talk forever, but how that looks, let me just end with this before you say anything more. What that looks like in an 18-month-old is different than what it looks like in a 5-year-old, and it's different than what it looks like in a 9-year-old or a 40-year-old or a 60-year-old. So I would say that one of the interesting things for educators is to figure out what they should be looking for in the group of kids that they work with. What does curiosity look like in their students?
Right. And I think that's really important that you mention, you know, the different ages, but also the individual children that we might work with and see how these things may manifest. Because one of the things that I've really wrestled with in studying curiosity is the idea of it being a state as opposed to a trait, right? Are some kids just curious kids, or can all kids get in that mode given the right conditions? And I you know, and I know it's probably both, but you know, I know that there's movement for individual children, but I'm just thinking from the lens of a teacher, how do we reach, you know, knowing what we know about curiosity? Is it the goal to get that? You know, does everyone have a little kernel of that somewhere that we could pull out as teachers?
$1 million question. So I'm going to answer it. I'm going to say what I think, and then I want you to tell me what you think, because we've had a quick conversation about this before. So my view of this has been the past. Now it's not 12 years. Now it's about 17 or 18 years that I've been studying this. My view of this is a developmental one. So all babies, all typically developing babies, let's say, so most babies are born curious. And in the first 2 years of life, most children, most typically developing children, are insatiable in their hunger for knowledge. And anybody in this audience who has had a child or babysat for a child or worked in an early childhood program knows what I'm talking about. It's exhausting. They can't stop putting things in their mouth, looking, tapping, shaking, opening. And that is because they experience insatiable curiosity. They have what I call a novelty detector. Everything that's unexpected, they notice. And they have this built-in urge to understand it more, to make it less unfamiliar. So I would say that virtually every baby is curious. And I'll say two more things that go with that address your question. That said, pretty quickly in life, I would say by 3 or 4, you begin to, well, I would say as far back as we've measured it or done research on it, you begin to notice individual differences. So some kids, just like some kids have more energy than other kids, or are more outgoing than other kids. And I could talk about that later. There's a link between temperament and curiosity, which we could talk about later. But kids who are just like, give me the world, let me out, let me in. Those are the kids who have a very high level of curiosity, and a more withdrawn child or a more tentative child or a more timid child may seem somewhat less curious because they're a little more overwhelmed by new experiences. So they're a little more cautious about investigating. So yeah, there are individual differences and they start early on. Like I said, I think they're probably start at the beginning, but they begin to be apparent by age 3. That's the good news, that all kids are curious, and yes, there are individual differences, but they're all kind of eager for information. As I've said in my work, in my written work, in research on question asking, if you look at question asking, if you measure all the questions kids ask in the second year of life, they ask as many as 2 questions a minute. Is that right? Yes, 2 questions a minute. And even the quietest child, the most incurious child, is likely to ask 1 question every 2 minutes. So that shows you how curious the average toddler is. That is not the case by the time kids get to school. By the time kids get to school, all of them seem less curious, virtually all of them. They ask fewer questions, they investigate less, and the individual differences are much more marked. Then, so glad to talk about that more. But the thing I want to say that you touched on, Wendy, is that we also know that by the time kids are 5, there's a huge, you talked about trait state. I was talking about trait just now, but here comes the state part. By the time kids are 5, they're incredibly responsive to their environment. So like in one piece of research, when kids are brought into a room with an interesting box, and all the boxes have the box has drawers, and all the drawers have something cool or mysterious in them, and the researcher measures how quickly kids come up to the box, how many drawers they open, how many objects they handle. You see a lot of individual difference. Like some kids rush up, they open every box. Every teacher here knows what that looks like. And another kid is more wary, and they look and they wait, or they timidly open one box. But it also matters if there's a grown-up in the room and what the grown-up is doing. So grown-ups that look friendly and go, oh yeah, that's cool. All kids, even the more timid ones, are more likely to go up to the box. And a teacher who sits very impassively, I'm not good at this, but like this, or says, or even says, oh, not right now, it's lunchtime, or oh, don't make a mess, oh, we don't go that way. Kids are less likely to explore. And the kids who had a lower level of trait curiosity in the first place are even more responsive to those adults. So the take-home lesson for teachers is that the kids in your class who most need to have their curiosity encouraged are the ones who are most susceptible to any form of discouragement.
And such a powerful message.
I guess, yeah. But I don't think, this is the thing that you and I got in the discussion about. Oh, I want to hear more about what you think about this. I don't think it is realistic to say that all kids are super curious by the time they're in second grade or eighth grade, because they're not. So, and the intuitive way of thinking about this, the everyday way, is we all know grownups who don't seem that curious, and they're probably not that curious. Some of that waning of curiosity is probably inevitable. Who could be as curious as a 2-year-old and get through life? You know, it's adaptive to kind of narrow down. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who are way less curious than they should be or could be. And that has to do, I think, with education. And so, but I don't think it's realistic for teachers to think that every kid is super curious and that if you just do the right thing, they're going to become, it's going to blossom, any more than, I'm going to say something controversial for the group. Someone's going to hate me for saying this, but any more than every kid is super athletic or every kid is super smart. There are individual differences on all these dimensions. So for me, the educational goal is not to make every kid, you know, Charles Darwin, who was incredibly curious, and there are great stories about him as a child, just relentlessly trying to find out things, even when it got him in trouble. But the goal of education should be to help each kid move a little bit, become a little more curious, and maybe regain some of their earlier curiosity. But they won't all be the same, ever.
Right. And I want to pick up on something you just said about the kid, about, well, two things, about the kid who's getting into trouble, and how difficult it would be if we retained that responding to everything in our environments, you know, and how, you know, a 2-year-old that's doing that is melting down by the afternoon because it's too hard to be in the world taking in this information in such an intense and deep way. And so we do have an adaptive shift where we, you know, we adjust to what we need to do to function in our worlds, but also what we are calling curiosity is sometimes associated with being naughty. I mean, that's not what we're asking kids to do. We're not asking them to climb under the table and you know, unscrew things, and we're not asking them, because school is, in a way, by its nature, the way it's designed, I don't think it's the best design, top down. It's an adult agenda at school. It's what we think kids ought to experience and know, to function in a world that we've set up for them. So, you know, a school run by children, and it's really fascinating to see. I've done some work in Denmark where preschoolers have their own space that adults aren't even allowed in, which for us that seems crazy and dangerous. But for kids in Denmark, I mean, there's much more of a child focus. So a curious kid in a kid's world is very different than a curious kid in an adult's world, in terms of the most curious kids aren't going to do what we want them to do. So how do we walk that line, I guess, is a question of encouraging curiosity, but not, you know, not encouraging the kind of chaos that could ensue if everyone really was purely curious.
I mean, I guess I have a couple of answers, but they're not firm. So tell me what you think. One is, you said something about we have a top-down school and system in this country, and honestly, that's for good reason. You know, I use this great photograph when I lecture in education, when I'm talking about Jerome Bruner, the great American psychologist who had so much to say on early development and education. And when I'm lecturing about him, I have this picture of this little boy walking behind 2 older men on the street. It's a candid photograph, and he's posing just like the men in front of him, the little boy, because little kids want to be like grown-ups. We've adapted to be like that. That's how we get to the grown-up world. That's how we become who we're going to become. And, you know, we could talk about later about role modeling, how important it is to model curiosity, because kids want to be like grown-ups, and they depend on grown-ups to guide them and to shape their world. And that's reasonable. I think that's sort of the nature of development for kids, to push their way into grown-up behavior. They want it. That said, you talked about running by an adult agenda. So the question that started me on my path to study curiosity was, what is the adult agenda? So if you were teaching in a school, and this goes back to my early research, because after I realized that teachers really cared about curiosity, I also realized that many of them care about it, but they don't see it as an outcome that can improve in their school year. So like many teachers think that their kids are either bright or not bright or shy or bold, and they can't do much with that, but they think that they can get them to learn more math or get to be better readers or be kind to, maybe kinder to others. There are things they think can change and things they don't think of as something they could help change. Curiosity is something they could change, but most teachers don't think about that as the thing they want to change. So if you had a group of kids in September and you think, okay, I'm going to notice who really asks questions, who figures out what they want to know, because it's not always tinkering or breaking things apart or, pulling all the books down all the shelves. Sometimes it's figuring out what you don't know that you want to know or what you need to know to solve the problem. This is something I talk about in my new book a lot. So kids want to solve problems, and you have to help them figure out the problems they want to solve and then help them think of what they need to know to solve the problem. And when they have a problem they want to solve that requires information, they go after it. That's when their curiosity is very powerful. But if you as the teacher thought, okay, my job this year is to help this kid get a little more intrepid in finding out what he or she wants to know and articulate his questions or her questions more, and then get stronger and stronger at getting the answers to those questions. Because, the 2-year-old's a little scattershot. By the time you're 8 or 12, we hope that you get a little more focused in satisfying your curiosity. So if that were the agenda, then you wouldn't see it as a conflict between adult run and kid run. You'd think, oh, and then you'd say in June, so which of my kids got a little more curious this year? And which kids got better at satisfying their curiosity? So that's
really, sorry, go ahead.
No, jump in.
I just wanted to say, so it's really a different stance. If we're taking a different stance, and it's interesting for me because I teach future teachers, and I get them when they come out of the K through 12 system. So I get them when they're plopped into university and they're 18, and I ask them, what are you interested in? What do you want to write this paper about? What are you passionate about? I want you to write, or this is something I need to know your genuine interest because, or what are your genuine questions? And I find students are baffled by this. They feel like this is a trick. Yeah. What do you want me to know? What do I need to say? And I say, no, it's not a trap. What are you genuinely interested in? What strikes you? What topics? Let's figure out you. And they have been groomed. I find that is so unsettling for them. Absolutely. It's torturous for them to approach that. And I feel that in a way, it's not that they're not given the time. And I think that's what for me, I really keep coming back to time because the teachers, I agree with you. All the teachers I've talked to want this to happen. They say, I see these amazing, this wonder, this curiosity, they're getting carried away. It's so exciting, but I wish I didn't have to stop them because it's time for, social studies and I have to cut it. The most interesting thing that happened, I have to cut short. And you've written about that. And I love your writing about that, the students start to actually experiment and the teacher says, no more experimenting. It's time to go do science on a worksheet. And it's like, oh my God, but if we just had more time, if the teachers and the kids, so that when that bubbling up happens, you get carried away. Because I do think of curiosity as a bit of a getting carried away, or at least you have to get to the question, you have to lose time.
I guess so. First of all, I totally agree with you about time. And anybody who thinks this is going to happen, I've seen this in so many places. And often it's not teachers who are at fault. It's a system that pushes them towards these social studies facts or whatever. But so often, well, it's like I draw an analogy here to what we think about sort of development of social and taking care of other people and being a good friend or a good collaborator. We think those things are important, but we want them to happen in 5 minutes at the beginning of the day or Friday every once a month. It's some special instead of being the center. So if I've written about this in some other books, we have to flip it, put this at the center. Because if you had a group of students who actually knew what it was like to want to know something and then figure out how to know it, and people used to call this learning to learn, but that's the wrong way of thinking about it, because it still sounds like you're learning how to learn the things somebody else has told you must learn. But if we put this at the center, the other stuff should be at the periphery, actually, honestly. And it would come more easily if we focused on this. The one thing, Wendy, I might differ with you about is I think it's actually been a problem that those of us who care so much about this tend to talk about it in slightly whimsical terms, like wonder and getting carried away, because I don't disagree with you at the heart of it. I mean, I'm a researcher, so I spend my life getting carried away by the questions I ask. And I'm lucky that I get paid for that. Like, I know that's a great privilege. But I think in school, we might get farther if we understood that this doesn't have to be a rush of excitement, or it often doesn't look like that in young children. It looks very serious and work-like. I have 2 grandchildren, everybody. It's the biggest thing in my life. They're toddlers, they're cousins, and they live right next door, both of them. And they are very workmanlike in the way they find things out. They do it again and again. So I have chickens at my home and they want to get the eggs, and they go in there day after day, and then they drop them, and then they drop them a little harder, and then they try to not drop them so hard, and then they watch what comes out when they do drop them. I mean, it's very systematic, and they're very persevering. It doesn't look thrilling. It doesn't look like a day. It's not a birthday party. It's work, and it's good work. So I guess because this is an audience, I think, of mostly teachers, I think we should do more to figure out how to make this more, not work like in a drudgery way, work like systematic, deliberate. What are we going to find out? What questions are you asking? I don't disagree with you that getting carried away is the goal, but we don't want to wait for that moment of inspiration or thrill or wonder. We want to say, look, school is about figuring out what you want to know and then finding it out.
What does it look like on the ground,
Yeah.
right? And how do we plan for that? Because as teachers, we need to plan for that, and we need to create situations or allow situations where that can function. And I completely agree with you that it doesn't always look magical. And in fact, most of development, also as a developmental psychologist, I feel, the greatest thrill, I couldn't wait to have my own children. I had studied language development, and I couldn't wait to chronicle their language development. And then, it was a mess. I couldn't possibly chronicle. For one thing, none of us had slept, for years. And for another thing, we were crying, but the fits and starts, I was trying to, was that a word? Was that this? Did that mean that? I don't know. I mean, my daughter said it, but then she didn't say it again for another 4 months. And then, did that count? And it just became, I couldn't, Piaget was so impressive to me that I was going to do it, but I couldn't do it. And
so let's just say he had a lot of help. He had a lot of people taking care of his kids.
Exactly. He wasn't in the trenches in the middle of the night, but to say that, that we're going to chronicle or even develop or even scaffold this beautiful moment of curiosity or learning and let children, run in the field with wonder is like, right, that's not going to happen in school. And so what does it look like on the ground in the real world? And I just wanted to circle back a tiny bit to what we were saying before of our, are all kids curious, and is it a state versus a trait? Because I also think that it's not as hard to notice in kids who aren't extroverted. And there's a very big bias in our culture for extroversion, that, extroversion is the best. And those are the people who, we think are so smart and so interesting. And so, but there are those sort of slow to warm up little philosophers out there that are so filled with curiosity, and they just don't show well. And I also taught preschool for a little while, and I feel like it's cracking those nuts and seeing what those more timid or more inhibited temperament children do, and what and sort of their mental life, and how curiosity isn't always behavior. It may be something that we can't access. So, I mean, of course, as researchers, as teachers, we're in the business of behavior, but I would like to also leave room for those kind of more thoughtful, curious kids that are having a hard time maybe with the visceral world, but are developing this really interesting mental life.
So great what you're saying. I mean, first of all, I couldn't agree more. So my most recent book is really based on this idea that we we forget to think about the rich inner life of each child. And I don't mean inner in a foofy way, in a, wondering, imaginative way, though I like those words, but I mean that each kid is thinking their thoughts and curious about what's going on around them or pondering something. I mean, I'm gathering this amazing data right now with a former student of mine on the things that are on kids' minds when they're between 4 and 6 that don't show up in the lab because they're very hard, as you said, to assess on the spot. But it turns out kids are thinking about some really interesting, complicated intellectual topics. And most kids are, not just a few kids, like from a wide range of backgrounds and experiences. So I agree that I would say that one of the greatest gifts that teachers can give their classrooms is to go in there assuming that every kid has a rich intellectual life. And I use that word very deliberately. And that it's part of your job as an educator to get interested in their intellectual life, to be interested in what they think about and how they think. Rather than focus only on how you want them to think later. You start by being interested in what they're thinking about. And I would say, so you and I both know that researchers have figured out ways to assess curiosity, even in quieter children or more inhibited children. And I wouldn't want teachers, like I wouldn't want my grandchildren in a school where teachers were always assessing their curiosity. But I would love it and I would encourage teachers to, if any teacher is in this talk and thinks I need to make my classroom more organized around the idea of curiosity, I'd say there are two things you start with. One is begin noticing what children are expressing curiosity about, and don't just notice the exuberant, outspoken, shiny buttons. And notice, keep a little journal, and after two weeks, if you can't say something that each kid is curious about in your classroom, go back and look some more or listen some more. And people, one of the things, when you probably know this, I wrote a book a few years ago about curiosity called The Hungry Mind. And I tried to lay out in there the different kinds of things kids might be curious about. For instance, something I was always deeply curious about, which is gossip. Like, it's not always science. It's not always bugs or the stars or some of the things I've looked at more recently that kids are interested in, how the environment and how to make the environment healthier. Those are laudable, wonderful things to be curious about. But a lot of people are just curious what the girl next door brought in her lunchbox, or for grown-ups, what the woman next door is doing after 8 p.m. I mean, curiosity sort of powers the social world, and we could harness that better in school. So I digress. Pay attention to what the students in your classroom are curious about, and that's a great starting place as a teacher if you're interested in making this more the center of your classroom. And it's great because you don't have to buy any new materials. You don't really have to change your schedule too much. All you have to do is keep a little journal for a while, or turn on your iPhone for a while and record what they say. And there's wonderful, abundant research showing that kids ask their most intellectually kind of challenging questions when they're at home anyway, over meals. And I've done research on that, but so have some other really impressive researchers, better than I. And We could take a page out of that at schools, like what kids say when they're drawing or just eating snack or lunch or waiting online to use the bathroom. I don't know what kind of schools people are working in, but there are a lot of places to hear that. And all of that, believe it or not, is a response to what you said, Wendy, which is that shyer kids, quieter kids may be very curious and you need to listen. And I will say one more thing about that. Don't assume that they'll go on being curious quietly if you don't listen to it and encourage it, because I don't have really strong evidence for this yet because we just don't have the data yet. But I think that over time, lots of kids who are curious enough, they may not be the standouts, but they're curious enough. If they're not encouraged to pursue it, if their curiosity isn't fed, it will atrophy a bit. It'll shrink. And that's why you see so many grown-ups who are not curious. Somewhere along the line, it wasn't nurtured. And I would just give you an analogy about this. You know, curiosity is an appetite, and appetites need to be fed to stay healthy. And the best time to feel hungry is when you know you're going to get a meal. It's not good to be hungry if you never get fed. And in fact, after a while, it screws up your appetite. So they need to have their curiosity fed, not so they become Darwin, but just so it stays a vigorous part of who they are.
Yeah, it's such a powerful analogy there. I wanted to bring in someone in the chat. Karen is saying that she wishes we could question our reference to the real world, that the world's not really like the education systems that developed at least 140 years ago. Schools who provide time and realize children's healthy development rises from the participating in decisions about the work of learning, support curiosity. So back to this concept of school. What can we do with school? Yes, the way our education system was designed in this country is not, in some cases we're still working on an old model of what the point of school is. So maybe that's a place to go with this. Susan, what do you think is the goal of school?
Oh my
And then
gosh.
for me, it always becomes, I know this is crazy, but what's the goal of life? I mean, is if we're going to get into what is the point of school and what is the point of life? And has your view changed over time in what you think the goal of school is in your work, in all of the work you've done in schools and with teachers?
Yeah. I guess it's changed in the sense, in that how would I put this? It's simplified because I think it needs to be kind of simple. I think back to your point, you said schools, the way that they're designed, I don't think they're designed. I use this analogy in a different book I wrote about the goal of education called The End of the Rainbow, which is about the purpose of school. And when I drive on highways in the East Coast where I live in Massachusetts, often I see these crazy highways that were added and these exits and these bridges and these overpasses and then these other highways. And I get totally panicked because I can't find my way. But they're so hideous and they're so wasteful and they're so crazy complicated. And I think, well, one road was added and then another road was added and then this part of the road fell apart, so they added this part. And at some point you have a system that has no real design behind it. It's just mishmash of problems that are fixing other problems and creating new problems. And often I love our schools and I love public schools. So I just have to say that right out there. I think the goal of education in this country should be that it's all the same, public education, accessible and free to all. But as we're trying to work that out, so I don't blame our schools for having gotten the way they are, because we've done something very few other countries in the world have done, which is we've tried to educate a very wide range of kids to a very long list of goals. And we've done it in a relatively short period of time, just over 100 years, really, that we had that goal. So I'm very forgiving of how we got to where we are and very impatient, eager to make it better. And that brings me to the answer to your question. I have a simpler goal than I used to. I think at the end of the day, the goal of school is to help children learn how to have ideas. And that's what the new book is about. And in that book, I trace the development of the ability to have ideas as consisting of these two paths: inquiry, which is curiosity, and invention. And I think when kids are allowed to pursue those two things and encouraged to pursue their ideas, which is the point of all of that, no matter what specific things they know or don't know, whether it's algebra or the parts of a sentence, whatever, they will be in good shape. And so you said, what's the goal of life? This is very personal. This is not me as a scholar. How could I have evidence for this? But I think the purpose of life is to experience some well-being and to leave things a little better than you found them. But I honestly, I think if I were I too have taught, like you, Wendy, and if I were ever to go back into the classroom, I'd have a big sign. You talked about having children. After I had my first kid, I have 3 sons, I put a big sign on my wardrobes that said, next time, get an epidural. So parents in this audience will know what I'm talking about. I didn't the second time. I lost the sign and I forgot the second time. But I always tell that story to say, put a sign up on the classroom door, whatever you think is so important. You want children to develop their ability to have ideas. Put it up where you can see it and think every day, what am I doing to get them a little closer to that?
We do. We have to remind ourselves because there are so many constraints on us in the classroom, and we're trying to do so many things at the same time. And I think there really is a lot of pressure on teachers, sort of circling to what we talked about before, is that I've never met a teacher that wasn't, that didn't want to do things in a really interesting way in their classroom, that didn't set out with a lot of really amazing goals. And I've seen those goals of the teacher's own curiosity get squashed in some cases, where it's like, oh, here are these cool things I want to do, and yet here's this list of 1,000 things that I don't have time for, and so I'm going to have to pick and choose. And it's easy for us to sometimes get disheartened, but also to sometimes just forget, right? To just forget the chaos of the day.
I mean, you said something before. You said a great thing in there about you have to plan for this. So this will not just happen because it's sort of in the back of your mind. You have to think what part of today, and not with fancy, I'm not a big believer in fancy curricula. I think things should be simple so that the main focus is on the kids' activity, their mental activity. Often that's goes with physical activity, but it doesn't always. Sometimes it's just having a conversation or looking out the window. Teachers have to sort of think about whether they're creating enough time in the day for those kinds of things to happen, the real idea work, as opposed to the busy work. And I don't know what teachers are listening to this or will listen to it, but there are a lot of teachers who don't have a lot of freedom when it comes to this. They're constrained by the reason. I mean, understandably, they're constrained by departments of ed or principals or school directors or boards of ed, whatever. And what I would say to those people is try to sneak this in every day, like let something else go. Years ago, I was at a job at a college, and I was overwhelmed I had 3 small kids, a long commute. I said to a colleague who was in the financial world, I'm overwhelmed. I can't get everything done every day. And he said, make a list of the most important things you do every day to the least important. I was like, oh, this could be fancy. He's going to tell me some way to organize this list. And then he said, and then just draw a line through the middle and don't do anything that comes under the line. And it was earth-shattering for me because I was like, don't do the things under the line. But for teachers, like parents, pick the thing that's most important and make sure you do that first. And if some other things drop off, don't leave the important thing to the end of the day or till Friday afternoon. Do it first. So that's what I would say about this. Try to the best that you are allowed in your school, to make this at the center and to make it come first if you're having to fit things in.
You know, it's interesting that we've just come through COVID pandemic, and our entire way we teach and learn was upended. And we were mentioning before this session that there have been some silver linings to this tragic pandemic, and one is these slate school events, and another one is teachers had to let go in a way of so many goals for a day, because you can't have an 8-year-old on Zoom for 6 hours. And so teachers had to, you know, kind of get down to the bare bones of what are the fundamentals. I think there was something really, really beautiful about that it's kind of simplicity that you're talking about, and also to let go of, if they don't get X, Y, or Z content, they can still have an interesting learning experience. So I'm hoping that can free us up a little bit to say that maybe we don't have to be so attached to content, that maybe we can say, oh, it could be, you know, it could be parts of a sentence, or it could be this, but whatever it is, the stuff of learning shouldn't be the focus. It should be the process. And yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because I think of curiosity as sort of like this engine that starts the process, and yet we really are, you know, the way we're setting up schools is very content driven.
It is. And so for every teacher who might listen to this, who's struggled to get kids to want to learn something they feel they must, or they want to teach them content wise or specific skills, it's when kids have no drive to learn. And I don't mean here just interest, I mean drive to learn, because curiosity involves interest, but it also involves this sort of engine. That was a good, I like that word. It's a very Sisyphusian task. It's like Sisyphus rolling the rock up the hill and it keeps falling back on him. It's so hard to teach kids who don't have a drive to learn. It's virtually impossible, actually. And whereas if they have a drive to learn, it's very easy. It makes your job so much easier. So, and I would say that this is one place where research should be really is in your corner as a teacher. The research shows that when people are curious about the stuff they're learning, they learn it more easily, they learn more, they learn it for longer. And that's been shown in one experiment after another. And it's true at all ages. So it's not just that it's nicer for kids, you'll be more effective as a teacher, and they'll be more effective learners if they're curious. Now, I'll bet, I would hope that there's someone in the audience who's thinking this is unrealistic. Kids have to learn things they don't want to learn. And that's true. But one, that comes with development. That's not really true of a 4 or 5-year-old. It's more true of an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old. Like, our ability to force ourselves to do things we don't want to do emerges over time. And we have to allow it to emerge over time. It's not there right in the beginning. Why would we work against such a powerful human urge? Like, it's like, yeah, we're born with this incredible urge to find out, but let's put that aside and try to teach you something else. That just doesn't make sense. So it makes sense for teachers, especially if they're working in a K-12 or even a K-6 environment, to think about how to make this you said fundamentals before, and you used the word bare bones, to think about this also as the foundation. This is the foundation. If you develop an urge to learn, and you have the experience of wanting to learn something, and then you'll learn it, oh my God, that feels so good. That's as good as being hungry and getting to eat a sandwich. And if you have that experience when you're young, then even when you're learning stuff you're less intrinsically excited by, you'll harness that. You'll be able to use it and you'll learn better. So it's not, this isn't instead of getting kids to learn stuff. It's the basis of getting them to learn stuff. And we often don't use it enough as teachers. And I say that as a college teacher. So I teach courses in psychology, but I also teach young emerging teachers. And it's amazing to me how much even at the college level, we forget this essential idea that you start with people's urge to learn.
Starting with them. Yeah. And it sounds very much to me what you're saying reminds me of the Reggio Emilia idea of emergent curriculum, right? Is listening to children. And I know that that's very labor intensive, and, following them around and taking notes and then
Right.
designing experiences. But I've always wondered why a version of emergent curriculum hasn't come about in the K through 12 education. I've certainly done it in higher ed. I've certainly had, listened to my students' conversations and been able to create experiences that start with them in higher ed. And I wonder if it has to do with academic freedom, like you mentioned, that most teachers don't get to decide what they teach and how they start. But I wonder if that concept of emergent curriculum could be translated into more of what we do in designing curriculum in K through 12.
Could be. I mean, it's hard to do it. It's hard to do it well. It's very hard to do it well, which isn't a reason not to do it. Some of the Reggio Emilia schools I've seen are fantastic. And I remind people in the audience, nor was it developed just for sort of privileged kids you might expect to thrive in that kind of open environment. Quite the opposite. Children who might come from a less privileged or even a more disrupted or chaotic environment, again, I don't know why I talk about food so much. I just love to cook and eat. But it's like saying that because kids didn't get good food at home, you're not going to try to give them good food at school. You're just going to give them some other thing and force them to eat it. No, those are the kids that need to have salad or fruit at school, and they thrive when they have it. And I think that learning experiences, the only thing I would say where I might not differ with you, but I'd add is that I maybe one of the problems is emergent curriculum, when it's been introduced in this country and in some other countries, but mostly in this country, comes across as being sort of doctrinaire and all or nothing. Like, oh, now we have to listen to the kids all day long. We can only do what they show an interest in. And it becomes kind of precious and impractical. And as I said in the beginning of our hour together, kids very much want to be in the adult world. This is what Dewey talked about. Kids want to enter the world around them. They want to be part of it. I know my little kids love to help with the chickens. They love to help. They love doing the dishes for some reason. They love cooking. They love sweeping. They like doing the things they see grown-ups do. And they like doing things that matter to society, to the world around them. So it's not like either or. You can bring in things that you care about or that society cares about, whether it's topics or skills or activities, and kids can get interested in that. But it's not either or. I think the question is, are you listening for their interest and their questions and fanning the flames of that? But it's not like it's throw out the regular curriculum or throw out the things we want them to know and just do what they want to know. I think that's a false.
Right. We don't want to, take one hierarchy and make another hierarchy.
Great
I mean, in
it.
a way, wouldn't it be wonderful to hear these different voices and to sort of give them equal credence? I think makes me think of a more of a Paulo Freire model, is like everyone at the table has a voice and everyone at the table is respected for that voice. For one thing, you have to be at a table. I mean, you spoke of meals, at meal times is when these interesting things come out. And it's harder to do that, to sit down with a meal with 30 kids, right? I mean, so scale matters, I think.
Scale matters, but I've seen classrooms where that happens, so that's let's think about 30 kids in a classroom I'm thinking of that was a third and fourth grade in a public school where the kids made and ate their own lunch together. And the thing is, it took an hour and a half. And some kids every day, some kids had to make the lunch and some kids served it and some kids cleaned it up. But it was worth that hour and a half because of all that they were getting out of that, not least of which was the chance to talk to each other. Like conversation, in my view, conversation is the center of education. And it's what educated, privileged kids get often that some other kids don't get, which is time to talk to each other and adults who are interested in talking with them. It's very informal. It's a little messy. It's the gem of education.
Right. So if we
Wow.
could spend put that as a center of the day,
Yeah,
for instance, or something like that, something
yeah,
we build together, we work together, we enjoy
absolutely.
together. I love your idea of conversation being the center of
Oh,
education.
so important.
I think that and those are the situations that teachers talk about, right? They talk
Yeah,
about those moments on the periphery of the lesson plan when the kids got carried away. And, my concept of getting sort of carried away or losing
I
time,
like it. It's great.
that's maybe my little precious thing to hold on to. But the idea that you lose track of time when you're so engrossed in something and you're actually that's real. The real work may happen, right? The real work may happen on the
Yes.
side of what we're imagining to be
And
the
then,
lesson.
but then put it in the middle. Like, think at the end of the day, what conversations happened in my classroom today? Which ones were just with kids? Which ones was I part of? Were they interesting? I mean, you can think about it for yourself. When's the last time you left a conversation thinking something different than you started with? I ask myself that all the time. And I want to say that before we run out of time. I see some questions here, but a part of this is about teachers getting in touch. You said this already, when curiosity with their intellectual appetite. You have to be interested in what your kids are thinking about and talking about. If it's boring to you, it might be a little boring. Like, like it should be interesting to be in a classroom with kids, and you should get to hear some ideas you haven't heard before. So that's a good way to make sure these conversations have something meaningful in them. Okay, I see questions.
Yeah, and we're just about out of time, but it sounds like a lot of people are talking about problem-based learning, and it sounds like we're getting into the idea of community, why it's so important to work together as a community here. I think that we kind of come back around to some of the things that we started with
Yeah,
here. Is you were talking about surprise, and when you defined curiosity, you were talking about being surprised by the world, and maybe that's a good point to end on, is this idea of that you just said, sort of beautiful closing of the loop, is that the teacher, we have to be surprised too, right?
yeah,
If we're
great.
bored, if it's not authentic for us, if we're bored and incurious, then that's
That's
going to
great.
cause ripples.
That's
How
such a
do we
great
keep ourselves
point.
surprised in my life? And I guess maybe that's a question to end on, or do you have any final thoughts that you want to
Well,
say?
I have a thought, which is for all of you who are listening, who are teachers, you have the best job in the world. And one reason is because it's endlessly interesting, or it should be. And even if it's hard, even work in difficult circumstances, or you're struggling with competing goals from school community, and this I've seen this in every school I visited, from the poorest to the richest, and the most well endowed to the most sort of stripped bare, but where teachers are given a chance to enjoy being with kids and find some interest in that, really good things happen. And that's a nice task to set yourself. What do I have to do? It's what Wendy said, to make this an interesting experience for myself. Yeah, let's end on that.
Let's end on that note. Thank you so much, Susan. It's been such
What
a
a
wonderful
pleasure.
conversation and
Yeah,
a thrill for me.
me too. Bye,
Uh,
everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.